Well, thanks everyone so much for being here today. We're really pleased to host this program. My name's Eliza Canty-Jones, and I'm with the Oregon Historical Society. I know we can have folks from everywhere with us today, and that's one of the wonderful ways that we're able to have our speaker here. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, where we're located on the traditional homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other nations, indigenous nations of the Columbia River. We really encourage folks to take time to learn about the history of indigenous peoples in this place, the long and ongoing relationships between the people and the plants and land and animals here, and to learn about the history of violence and oppression and survival and resilience that attends the Native nations that are here in Oregon and wherever you are. So please, everyone, I encourage you to think about that Indigenous relationship to the place. Wherever you are in the United States, you're on Indigenous land. The mission of the Oregon Historical Society is to preserve our state's history and make it accessible to everyone in ways that advance knowledge and inspire curiosity about all the peoples, places, and events that shape our state. And we do this work in a wide variety of ways, one of which I'm sharing with you here on our screen. We're very excited to have a virtual lecture with Professor Erica Lee on September 8th, 2020 at 7 p.m. Going virtual with this lecture allows us to make even more tickets available, and we absolutely encourage folks to purchase a ticket to this program. Professor Lee is one of the nation's leading scholars on immigration and African American history. She teaches American history at the University of Minnesota, and she is the author of 4 notable books. Most recently, America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States. And that's the book she'll be speaking on September 8th. It is a fascinating and enlightening study, and we really encourage folks to purchase tickets and join us for the Erica Lee lecture, September 8th, 7 p.m. You can get tickets at ohs.org/Hatfield. Our program today is presented in partnership with the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education, a really outstanding organization that we're so fortunate to have in our community in Portland. OJMCHE explores the legacy of the Jewish experience in Oregon, teaches the universal lessons of the Holocaust, and provides opportunities for intercultural conversation. OJMC challenges visitors to resist indifference and discrimination and to envision a just and inclusive world. And I should say, like OHS and so many other museums and historical societies, OJMCHE's visitors are both in person and virtual these days. So be sure to check out all the offerings that they have. And they also have wonderful window displays at their museum in downtown Portland. So if you're taking a walk in downtown, be sure to stop by and check out the amazing history that they have on display there. I'll make one other quick advertisement for OHS. We encourage folks to sign up for our emails. You can go to ohs.org and receive weekly emails full of fantastic history content, learning more about Oregon history and finding out what's up at OHS. Later today at 3 p.m., we'll also have a program specially for teachers on the curriculum that attends our exhibit, Nevertheless They Persisted, a history of women's voting rights and civil rights and protest and democracy. The lesson plans that attend this are really fantastic for middle and high school students. So if you are an educator or know one, please sign on this afternoon for that program as well. Okay, it really is my pleasure to welcome today's speakers. I couldn't be more thrilled. A friend and colleague passed me a copy of Jeanne Theoharis' book about 6 weeks ago, and the timing couldn't have been better. I gobbled it up, and I really appreciate, Professor Theoharis, you accepting our quick invitation to speak to our audience today. Professor Theoharis is the author or co-author of 9 books and numerous articles on the civil rights and Black Power movements, the politics of race and education, social welfare, and civil rights in post-9/11 America. Her biography, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, won a 2014 NAACP Image Award, the Letitia Wards Brown Award from the Association of Black Women Historians, and was named one of the 25 best academic titles of 2013 by Choice. The book she'll be speaking about today is A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History, which won the 2018 Brooklyn Public Library Literary Prize for Nonfiction. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, MSNBC, The Nation, The Atlantic, Slate, Salon, The Intercept, the Boston Review, and the Chronicle of Higher Education, and now for the first time to an Oregon Historical Society audience. We're really grateful because guiding her through this conversation about the book is another big fan of hers, Emmett Till, who for 25 years taught high school social science in the Beaverton School District before joining the Oregon Department of Education as the state social science specialist in the fall of 2018. His work includes helping to create and implement new ethnic studies standards for integration into social science classrooms, kindergarten through high school. ODE is helping to create guidance and support materials for the implementation of the new Tribal History Shared History curriculum and the upcoming Holocaust and other genocide social sciences standards. Emmett is a wonderful colleague who always answers our questions and helps to find more ways to get good history to teachers and to classrooms. And we're really grateful to have him with us today. So I'm gonna turn off my camera and turn it over to the two of you. I will say, folks, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A to enter in questions. If you're watching on Facebook, you can enter questions in there as well. And then I'll come back on 15 minutes or so before 1 o'clock and bring in some questions from the audience. So welcome to our speakers, and please take it away.
Great, thank you, Eliza. And good afternoon, Professor Theoharis. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you. I really enjoyed your book. As Eliza said, I've been recommending it to our Oregon social science teachers for about a year now, and it's just a great honor to get to speak with you today. So we're coming from Portland, and maybe surprisingly to some, Portland has really become sort of the flashpoint for the Black Lives Matter movement and just the continued protests that have followed since May 25th. And recently you've written in the Washington Post about this idea of the focus that happens with protests and maybe the lack of focus around movements prior to protests. I was wondering if you wanted to just kind of speak to that and give us some grounding in what you're seeing around the country now.
Thank you. And it's wonderful to be here, to be together, even in this weird way that we're now together. Though I have to say, I've never been to Portland, so it would have been fun to be in person. So yeah, I wrote in the Washington Post last week. Last week was the 55th anniversary of the Watts Uprising. And the Watts Uprising is often the very first time that the Black freedom struggle outside the South makes an appearance in most textbooks, most high school textbooks, and even many books used for college, right? And what we don't tend to learn is that there is a long movement in LA in the decade before the uprising that's challenging school segregation in the city, that's challenging housing segregation in the city, that's challenging police brutality in the city. And over and over, they're being met by public officials, Los Angeles residents, either dismissing the issue, demonizing them as troublemakers. And so they've gotten very little, right? When a traffic stop, right? What sets off the Watts Uprising is a traffic stop. A young man by the name of Marquette Fry is stopped for drunk driving. And when police start to beat up both him and his mother, the crowd has had enough. And it leads to 5 days of uprising in Watts. And so I think it's important to kind of see this long movement in LA before that, because I think it means we ask different questions, and we should have asked different questions at the time to public officials, to the mayor, to the police chief, who had been ignoring or demonizing those protests. So for instance, in 1961, the Los Angeles NAACP again brings a pattern of police brutality to the LA Police Commission, and they're dismissed. People may know in 1962, the unarmed Secretary of the Nation of Islam, Ronald Stokes, is killed outside the mosque and 5 other members of the nation wounded. Malcolm X comes to the city to join a kind of burgeoning United Front movement that sort of spans the NAACP to Black radicals like Cyril Briggs to up-and-coming Black politicians to the nation. Again, the NAACP brings this pattern of police brutality in '63. They're rebuffed. The head of the NAACP, Roy Wilkins, talks about how much the kind of police in LA are a problem in '63. Again, the NAACP is blamed for causing the problem that they're supposedly talking about. I say this because I think if we start the story of the Watts Uprising with this movement, we have to ask different questions about why, about accountability, about responsibility, about what gets us to this point. And these are similar questions to, I think, what we need to be asking today. So again, the way we're seeing the Portland uprisings being covered, or in Minneapolis, or in New York, tends to start the story with George Floyd. Or maybe it starts the story with, Mike Brown. But it doesn't tend to, even journalists doing kind of deep dives into the extent of police brutality or the extent of racial inequity in the criminal justice system, we're not seeing a same kind of attention to longstanding movements in Portland or New York or Minneapolis or Chicago, where again, public officials didn't either dismiss those movements, disparage those movements, didn't respond. And I think holding accountable, right, our leaders requires, I think, that attention to these long-standing movements and protests in these cities that, began far before the uprisings we're seeing now. And I think it asks us to account for why we have been, our inaction, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think for many of our viewers, and I know for many people who have contacted my office in Oregon, not just in Portland, that history of movement and appeals to government officials in Oregon and Portland is not well known. I mean, we know that it's out there, but it's certainly not addressed in our classrooms, and it's not sort of elevated into the part of the civic conversation. And I think that's part of what we're seeing here, a real call to bring that forward.
Yeah.
Your book, A More Beautiful and Shareable History, was published in 2018, before this surge that we're seeing now. And the interest really that has grown, prior to May 25th with the 1619 Project, there's been sort of this revitalization around Black history. But your book does, and you talked about Michael Brown just in your last answer there, but it does bring in the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yes.
How does this book fit into this discussion we're having now in 2020?
Right. So the book was sort of motivated by what I found to be this kind of interesting, curious, one of the arguments of the book is that arguably the civil rights movement now occupies a kind of pride of place in the way that the United States tells its history, right? The civil rights movement is celebrated. I think we saw this when John Lewis died a few weeks ago. I think we saw this certainly, again, we're going to talk about Rosa Parks hopefully today when Rosa Parks dies in 2005, right? People who survey high school students find that the two Americans that high school students identify the most, famous Americans outside of US presidents, are Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, right? And so the history of the civil rights movement has taken on an increasingly central place in terms of how we talk about our democracy and its expansiveness and its ever improvingness. And yet much of the way we tell that history is distorted, is misused. And then it took on a particular, I think, dangerous and devastating quality when we saw Black Lives Matter kind of emerge on the national stage after the police killing of Mike Brown, where you saw over and over people telling Black Lives Matter activists to be more like Martin Luther King, to be more like the civil rights movement. And so sort of weaponizing this fable of the civil rights movement against young activists. And of course, in my head, I was like, be careful what you wish for. They are being like the civil rights movement. But it took, so part of the motivation of the book was to look at sort of how we'd gotten this national fable and the work it does for us in the present, and then what a larger, more expansive, more sober history of the era gives us for today. And I think part of what it gives us for today is the title of the book is taken from a James Baldwin quote in that beautiful piece that he writes for teachers called The Talk to Teachers. And in it, he says, American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone's ever said about it. And I think both the way that the civil rights movement is distorted is done in a way to make us feel good about ourselves as a nation. It becomes a tale of American exceptionalism, where the United States is just constantly getting better and better and better, and the civil rights movement proves that. And so grappling with a fuller history of the civil rights movement is much more sobering. It's much more, we have to grapple with how pervasive racial inequality is, but it's also more beautiful. And I think it gives us more today in terms of how to take the struggle forward. Because I think it's actually more inspiring when you really get into what actually happened, when Rosa Parks isn't just trapped endlessly in that moment on the bus. When we actually hear the first part of Dr. King's speech in the March on Washington about the bad check, right? When we see the role of teenagers. So many things I think make it even better. And give us, I think, so much for where we are today, both sobering and inspiring.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you mentioned a couple things there, but you mentioned John Lewis and Rosa Parks, and I want to make sure we get to both of those. But just starting with Mrs. Parks, you've written extensively. There's a separate book, The Rebellious Life of Miss Rosa Parks. She also makes an important appearance in this work. Along with Ruby Bridges, she might be the most recognized female figure in the civil rights movement. And so can you share with us how you believe her story is misused and mistold, and an example of that fable that you referred to, the civil rights fable?
Right. So I think, right. I mean, Rosa Parks, so I come to this, writing the book on Rosa Parks when she dies. And people may remember, Rosa Parks dies in 2005, she's 92, and she becomes the first woman, the first US civilian to lie in honor in the US Capitol. This epic honor. Her body is flown to Montgomery. She dies in Detroit, her body is flown to Montgomery, then brought to DC. President Bush lays a wreath on her coffin. It's epic. But how she's being honored. She's endlessly talked about as quiet, not angry, quiet, humble, quiet, soft-spoken. She's largely trapped on the bus. And even in the accounts that give her a slightly fuller history, there's a kind of gendered, she was the NAACP secretary. Her radicalism, her anger, her long, long, long history, both before and after the boycott, is really truncated. It's really obscured. Her long-standing belief in Black power and self-defense and reparations and the injustice in the criminal justice system, right, is not part of the story we tell about Rosa Parks. We tend to trap her on the bus. And so to grapple with a fuller history of Mrs. Parks is to see, I think, a couple of things, right? It is to see how long, that when we get to that epic moment, December 1st, 1955, when she makes her stand on the bus, she is kind of, in today's language, burned out, right? She's been struggling for a long time at that point. She joins the NAACP in 1943 because she's galled, it's World War II, and she wants to be able to vote, and she's galled that Black people are serving overseas and they can't vote at home. And she's going to spend the next 12 years alongside a small group of activists in Montgomery trying to kind of transform the Montgomery NAACP into a more activist chapter. They're working on issues of criminal justice, both the over-incarceration of and wrongful accusations against Black men, and the way the law does not protect Black people, and particularly Black women, from rape. So these are issues that we're less familiar with. Then we also don't have a sense of how much her bus stand costs her family, right? and costs her, right? She loses her job. Her husband loses their job. They never they never find steady work again. They get constant death threats. So actually 8 months after the end of the Montgomery bus boycott, the successful end of the Montgomery bus boycott, the Parks family is forced to leave Montgomery and they move to Detroit, where her brother and her cousins live. And if you knew that, that tends to be like the last sentence in the biography, right? And then she moved to Detroit, and then it's like, oh, and then she lived happily ever after. When actually, like Rosa Parks will describe Detroit as the Northern Promised Land that wasn't. And she will spend the next 40 years challenging the racism of Detroit, of the Jim Crow North, in and alongside a growing Black Power movement in Detroit and across the country. Rosa Parks will describe Malcolm X as her hero, as her personal hero, and we'll see no contradiction between loving Martin and loving Malcolm, right? Between sort of loving Ella Baker and Queen Mother Moore, right? She's like the broadness of the group of activists that she is sort of engaging with. And I think, again, we trap her in this sort of moment, but we also trap her in a kind of passiveness and a kind of gendered respectability politics, when that doesn't at all do justice to kind of the scope of her life. To the end of her life, she is saying the struggle isn't over, there's a lot more work to be done. And so when I think one of the greatest misuses of Rosa Parks is the way we tend to put her story in the past. She would kind of lament the fact that people would often ask her if she knew Harriet Tubman, right? Which in some sense is like what she did is being treated as like distant history, right? When she just keeps going, right? In the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s. And so I think often we use the way we honor Rosa Parks in ways that doesn't do justice to how much she's saying there's more work to be done, right? A statue for Rosa Parks, right, which George W. Bush commissions in 2005, is unveiled in 2013. And in a rare moment of bipartisanship in President Obama's second term, he's joined by Mitch McConnell, John Boehner, Nancy Pelosi, John Lewis at the Capitol to dedicate this statue to Rosa Parks. It's the first full-size statue of a Black person in the Capitol Statuary Hall. Now, on that very same day, across the street, the Supreme Court is hearing arguments in Shelby County v. Holder, right, which is the case brought by Shelby County, Alabama, challenging a portion of the Voting Rights Act. And what we know happens 3 months later is the Supreme Court sides with Shelby County and basically declares sort of the pre-clearance part, like which municipalities face pre-clearance, as sort of not relevant to present day, like trapped 40 years ago. So again, the dangers of this memorialization, right? So on a statue is relevant, right? But in many ways that helps to kind of maintain this argument that these problems are in the past, right? And so what the Supreme Court decides in Shelby, and we've seen the kind of voter suppression that's followed, is that these places that were required to pre-clear their voting rules, that's a leftover from a bygone era. And Congress can come back with a new formula, but that old formula for those municipalities is now not relevant. And what we've seen is like a dramatic expansion of voter suppression techniques since then. So I think, that we have this statue of Rosa Parks on the same day that this thing that she fought decades for is getting undermined is not just a paradox. It's part of how this kind of argument I'm making about kind of the ways, the political uses of this mishistory or this fable.
Right, I think about that for our teachers and our students, and just how, the 14th and 15th Amendment, 150 years ago, and then the Voting Rights Act, how when those are put into the past and sort of these dead letter, documents, and we've solved it because we wrote it down,
yep.
How we sort of lose track of the implications for today, right? And I like, what you're saying around these moments where we're celebrating our past are really also reminders of how we need to stay engaged with our present, and the history really guides us into understanding what's brought us to this point and how we can maybe solve some of these issues or get to airing out of some of these issues. So you talked previously also about sort of the cudgel of the lessons of the civil rights to be used by activists. And in the book, you outlined 10 lessons that was used in the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And the MIA was attempting to advance specific goals. This was the integration of the city bus program. But it seems like a number of the lessons remain relevant to the protests and progress we're seeing today. Can you walk us through some of these lessons? And I'm thinking particularly about the ones around perseverance, anger, and economic disruption, and maybe how they apply to what we're seeing now.
Yeah. So every school child now learns that Rosa Parks did something courageous on that day, December 1st, 1955. When she refuses to give up her seat on the bus. But I think we actually miss what is deeply courageous about it because we don't look at the history beforehand. So as I was saying before, Rosa Parks has this long kind of activist history before. She's actually made stands on the bus before. Other people have made stands on the bus before. One of the things that she has refused to do, some Montgomery bus drivers would make Black people pay in the front but have to get off and reboard in the back. And she refused to do that. So she'd been kicked off the bus multiple times, including by the bus driver that she will encounter that day. There also had been a trickle of bus resistors in the decade, kind of from World War II to when Mrs. Parks makes her stand. A woman by the name of Viola White in 1944 refuses to give up her seat, is arrested, decides to pursue her case. In response, police rape her daughter. And then the state uses all these tricky maneuvers never to hear her appeal of her case. And so her case just gets tied up in court without a resolution, and Viola White actually dies. One of Rosa Parks's neighbors, a Black veteran by the name of Hilliard Brooks in 1950, also similar to Mrs. Parks, refused to get off the bus and reboard in the back. He has an argument with the bus driver calls the police, and the police shoot and ultimately kill Hilliard Brooks on the bus. Then 1955, many people now are familiar with the story of Claudette Colvin. In March of 1955, a 15-year-old high school student by the name of Claudette Colvin refuses to give up her seat on the bus. She's arrested, police manhandle her, they have their hands all over her as they drag her from the bus. So Rosa Parks knows all these cases. She's been active like in this decade, and so she knows very much what can happen to her, right? She, Hilliard Brooks has been killed, what can happen to a Black woman in police custody, right? So she knows very much the kind of violence, both physical and economic violence that could follow. But more importantly, and I think this is the thing we miss, is she's made stands before, right? Around bus segregation, around school segregation, around criminal justice. Other people she knows have made stands before. There is nothing to suggest that making a stand on this day will make any difference, right? And yet, and still, she does so, right? And that's the courage of perseverance. That's the courage of being able to act even when you don't know and really have no optimism that this is necessarily going to produce anything different, right? I think the way often the story is told is somehow it's just like she knows that if she resists, then it will change something, and that's just not how it works. So that's the first lesson, right? Is that you have to be able to take action without being able to see what will follow. I think the second lesson is that bravery doesn't mean that you're not scared. So she talks about how she didn't think she would get off, she wasn't sure she'd get off the bus alive. Who actually calls for the boycott is a women's political group in Montgomery called the Women's Political Council that had been increasingly active around bus segregation in Montgomery. And it's that night after Mrs. Parks is arrested that they decide to call for a one-day boycott on Monday, which is when Rosa Parks will be arraigned in court. So in the middle of the night, Joanne Robinson, who's the head of the Women's Political Council, who's a professor at Alabama State College, sneaks into Alabama State College with the help of a colleague and two students who let her into the like mimeograph room or Xerox room, and they basically make like 50,000 leaflets that say another woman has been arrested on the bus, boycott on Monday. And at like 6 a.m. the next morning, you see the women of the Women's Political Council kind of fan out over Montgomery, like leaving these leaflets all over Montgomery, right? So the power of organization. Early that next morning, E.D. Nixon, who is a longtime activist, he gets a call from Joanne Robinson that this is about to happen. And so he calls a young minister in town, right? A new-ish minister in town, and this is a 26-year-old Martin Luther King. And at 6 a.m., he wants to use King's Church to have a meeting that night to get the community on board for this boycott. King is a brand new father. They've had a baby 3 weeks earlier, their first baby, and they're fairly new in town. The Kings have been there about a year. He wakes King up, right? And like most of us, when somebody calls you with a scheme at 6 in the morning, King says what most of us would say, which is, can you call me back, right? I need to think about it. And I mentioned this because I think the second lesson is that we sort of assume that there's something that you just know in these moments, right? That it's just, there's like a sign and he's Martin Luther King and you don't know. And I think what we see with Rosa Parks, what we see with Dr. King is they're gonna have to make decision after decision, right? They're gonna have to step into this and step into this and step into this. So that's the second lesson, is that you're not gonna not be afraid but you're gonna act anyways, right? Because when E.D. Nixon calls King back a few hours later, King says, yes, we can use my church. And Nixon says, good, I've been telling people they were gonna meet there already, right? And over the days and weeks and months, King is going to become kind of the leader of this local movement, but there is nothing foreordained about it. There's nothing easy about it. A third thing I would say would be our image of the Montgomery bus boycott is that it's all about walking. And certainly people walk, but how they sustain and what they decide that Monday after it's so successful is they changed it from a one-day boycott to an indefinite boycott. And then they organized this incredible carpool system where they set up 40 pickup stations all around town, and people volunteer their cars and people drive for the boycott. And this is how they sustain a year-long boycott, because they're giving 10 to 15,000 rides a day. And so this is massively organized and coordinated. And so kind of understanding like that work. I think it's also not only about bus segregation, right? Bus segregation is a way into a larger system of inequity and segregation. 4 days before Rosa Parks makes her bus stand, she attends a packed mass meeting, actually at Dr. King's church, because the lead organizer in the Emmett Till case has come to Montgomery to bring the bad news that the two men who had lynched Emmett Till, again, Emmett Till is the 14-year-old Chicago boy who goes to Mississippi to visit his uncle and is lynched for making a comment to a white woman. And because of the national outcry, because of what his mom does and opens the casket, we actually see the indictment of the two men who kill Emmett Till. But this organizer, Dr. T.R.M. Howard, has come to Montgomery to bring the news that the two men have been acquitted. And in fact, there has been rising violence against civil rights workers in Mississippi, right? So he's come to bring this devastating news, but to say that we need to fight on. So there's Rosa Parks, there's E.D. Nixon, there's many of the people who are gonna become the backbone of the Montgomery bus boycott there that night, right? And it's devastating and it's angering, right? Because they had worked on a number of cases in Montgomery that had never gotten the attention that they had managed to get to Emmett Till, and still in all, his killers went free, right? So this is devastating. And I think we can see her, Rosa Parks will talk later about how on the bus that day, when the driver asks her to move, she says she thinks about her grandfather, longtime believer in self-defense. She thinks about how she'd been kind of pushed as far as she could be pushed. She says she thinks about Emmett Till and that if she got up, she would be consenting to this treatment, and she did not consent. And so I think that power of anger and of acting where we can, right? So that, does Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus get justice for Emmett Till? Not necessarily. But if you understand this as a system of racial injustice and inequality, then you act where you can, right? And so I think that's another lesson that we can see.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. Again, tying those different events, that are sometimes just put on a timeline and just called out just quickly, and then really linking those together is really helpful in giving us a fuller picture. The bus boycott, had this element of economic disruption, right? There was a pressure point there for the city.
Yes.
Is there a parallel today? Is that still a useful piece?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I've found so disappointing about the ways people tend to talk about the civil rights movement is they don't, and this kind of misuse of the civil rights movement is that at its base, it was disruptive, and it understood the need to be disruptive. And it was understood to be tremendously disruptive, right? The idea of the Montgomery bus boycott is to use the power, that like Black purchasing power, right, to stay off the buses. They couple that with a boycott of downtown businesses at Christmas. It is meant to be disruptive, right? This idea that like this constant, like, Dr. King wouldn't take a freeway kind of criticisms of Black Lives Matter just don't comport with what the civil rights movement actually did and what people like Dr. King and Rosa Parks believed, which was that disruption was that part of how oppression continues is because it's comfortable, and that disruption was necessary to bring that tension to the surface. And so over and over, right, the kinds of tactics of economic disruption, of political disruption, of people putting their bodies like in spaces, right? These are tactics of the civil rights movement that we're seeing used today. And I think it's important to see both the continuities of that, so to not let this kind of, again, mythic fable of the civil rights movement be used against, but also the power of disruption, right? The power of having to, and again, it's not just a one-off, right? That like, sometimes the way it's sort of taught is that it's just like there's a Montgomery bus boycott and then it changes. And both all the years before the Montgomery bus boycott, but also like a year of struggle, right? And what that means, and all of that work and all of the sacrifice, right? So, we often focus on the physical violence, but I think one of the things that Rosa Parks' story, points us to is also the economic violence, right? So many activists like Rosa Parks lose their jobs, right? That's a weapon that's used against the civil rights movement, and the kind of red baiting of the civil rights movement. So tactics that we see again today, right? Constantly being called troublemakers and extremists.
Yeah. So you opened with sort of reference to John Lewis, and I think many people had the opportunity to watch the ceremony and the funeral, the eulogizing that was happening with John Lewis. And your book is this warning about the use and misuse of history, and there was a lot of that, and several speakers, presidents, and activists spoke about Lewis's work and life. But do you see sort of any warning signs in the way that we're remembering John Lewis, and maybe some other things that you would like to highlight about his work, and both during this, during the era of the civil rights movement that we think about in the 60s, but also in his life's work going forward?
Right. So I think a couple of things. The first is the way we need, if we're gonna, and so many people started to sort of talk about how we need to rename the Edmund Pettus Bridge, right? And I would say that we need to think bigger than that, right? That the way to honor John Lewis, right, is to restore and expand the Voting Rights Act. And that we need to be very wary, as we can see in the story of Rosa Parks' statue on the same day as Shelby County Beholder, right? That like statues and bridge names, that these become ways that the people in power, that politicians act like they're doing something when what we need is to fix the structures of injustice that we still have, right? To restore and expand in terms of if we're thinking about sort of John Lewis's, over and over people talked about him giving blood on that bridge. And it's like, if we're going to talk about his blood sacrifice, then what we have to do today is make that, we need to be worthy of that in terms of really like redoubling our efforts at voting rights. And this has to come at the national level, but it also has to come at the state level, right? The second thing is, to me, one of the things in terms of the days of celebrating John Lewis that made me a bit nervous was also the ways that it, in some sense, eclipsed all of the people dying that don't have to be dying right now, right? And in particular, the kind of racial disparities in healthcare, the kind of environmental racism that has led to these disparities that we're seeing in terms of Black and Latinx communities being hit much harder by COVID, and the toll being even more devastating. And I think we need to be careful. And I wrote about this with Rosa Parks, because Rosa Parks dies about 2 months after Hurricane Katrina. And I think sometimes these civil rights memorials aim to put kind of more palatable images before us when we're in moments of tremendous kind of death and upheaval. And so I think kind of keeping our eyes on kind of all of the people dying that shouldn't have and that don't have to, again, from, again, the like unequal medical system we have, unequal access to healthcare, unequal kind of environmental factors, these kinds of things.
And so I know we're pressed for time, but I did want to ask you one more question, and then I know Eliza's going to come back on and use some of our questions from our audience. But in this moment in Portland, with the demographic makeup that we have in our city, and then the sort of popularity of this new podcast, Nice White Parents, we're hearing a lot from what people call white liberals or white moderate voices, and you also discussed this in your book from 2018. And I'm just wondering if you want to talk a little bit about how you see that voice and that sort of perspective really shaping not only the telling of the history, but the possibilities for action now.
Right. So in my book, I talk about it as the redneckification of racism, which is that part of the way we tell the history of the civil rights movement is it's like a kind of superhero like thing where it's like we have good guys and bad guys, and the good guys are sort of Black Southerners and Northern white liberals. But again, part of what we started our conversation about is like, well, if you turn our attention outside the South and look at sort of northern cities from Portland to New York City, those Northern white liberals might have pushed for change in the South, but when we look closer to home, we don't, we tend to see patterns of white resistance to school desegregation, housing desegregation, changing the police. And we see this both in terms of public officials in the North, we see it in terms of like local residents in the North, and we see it in terms of the media in the North. And that resistance doesn't look exactly the same as it does in the South, right? It tends to come in the form of gaslighting. It tends to come in the form of you need to prove there's a problem. Maybe we should have a committee for this. Maybe we need a commission, right? Over and over, you see in New York, in Boston, in LA, in Chicago, this constant community activists are met with this, particularly around things like school segregation, this sense that we don't necessarily have that problem here. So we'll have to see. We should study the issue. They have that in the South, but I don't know that we have that here, right? So this, and just this constant surprise. And I think this is sort of this point we started with, which is if you focus on the moment of the uprising and you don't look at the movements beforehand, then you have this tremendous liberal shock at Watts. You have this tremendous liberal shock at what happens in Detroit in 67 or Newark in 67. Why are they so angry, right? This shock around Black power. And an unwillingness to grapple with again, long-standing grievances that have been made public over and over and over in these same places that have produced almost no change. No change in school segregation. So in many ways, cities like New York City, schools are getting, if anything, more segregated in the decade after Brown. In Boston, they're getting more segregated in the decade after Brown, partly because there's this sort of influx of Black and Puerto Rican sort of migrants into the city. And so schools are getting more overcrowded because school officials keep redrawing those zoning lines to keep certain schools white and certain schools largely not white. And I think one of the most effective ways that white liberals find, right, to kind of obscure these demands is by saying the problem is kind of Black and Latinx culture, right? They don't value education the way, they don't have the right, values for success. And so we need to we need remediation programs, Dress for Success, all these kinds of programs that find their way all the way to the present, right? As ways to deflect systemic calls for desegregation, for resource equity, for hiring of more Black and Latinx teachers. You see that over and over being met with these kind of cultural arguments, these very dangerous cultural arguments that I think continue today.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really glad that you were able to join us today, and thank you to OHS and the Oregon Jewish Museum, Center for Holocaust Education for making this possible. And Eliza, I'm going to turn it over to you. I might have to wave goodbye because we are presenting an update on our ethnic studies to the State Board of Education today. So we're very excited about what ODE is doing to move forward on some of the material that we discussed. And I know this book is going to make it onto a lot of our classroom reading list. So thank you again.
Thanks, Emmett. Thank you, Jeanne. That was a really dense and rich conversation. I appreciate it. We have some questions from teachers, and I'm going to throw it open there for you and then answer the best way you can, because it's everything from how do you approach this subject with little kids? If you have like kindergarten to second grade, and if you've got any experience with that, we'd love to hear it. And then also teachers who are really struggling with teaching majority white classes, and also teaching students who are saying, wow, I'm really fascinated by this history, but now I'm really mad at my country, right? So how to approach this subject where there's so much violence, there's so much oppression, there's a lot of discouraging aspects to the subject. How do you approach it with little kids, and how do you approach it with broad ranges of kids so that they get the real truth, but don't just run away discouraged?
Well, I think with little kids, and again, just to use Rosa Parks, right? Like every little kid learns about Rosa Parks. But again, this fundamental distortion of her story, right? Which is that we don't tell it as a story of perseverance, of like ongoing struggle, right? That is a lesson that we can teach to first graders and second graders and kindergartners, right? Which is that Rosa Parks tries, and her and her friends try and try and try and try. And they're told that they're troublemakers and they're ignored and they can't find other people to support them. These are things, these are concepts that we can translate to very young people, right? And so part of my frustration in the way that Rosa Parks gets taught is that in some sense the story is richer and better and still possible to give to young people, very young people. Similarly, I think to see Rosa Parks not just in Montgomery, right? To see Rosa Parks as finding problems not just in the South, but in this new place that she lives called, Detroit. So that sort of seeing racism not just as a problem in one part of the country, but all over the country. I think that's an important lesson that, again, I think even little tiny people can learn. The second thing I would say is we have to be teaching the histories of struggle where we are, right? And not just the history of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. And so I think I teach at Brooklyn College in the City University of New York. And nearly all of my students get to me without having learned anything, right, about the Civil Rights Movement in New York. And I think we have to change that. And I'm working with a group of people in New York hoping to change that, because I think part of also giving this history to young people needs to be about seeing these spaces around us as spaces of struggle, seeing the issues that we are facing today as possible to challenge, and we stand on the shoulders of people who have challenged them before. I guess in terms of the violence, or in terms of like, this is disillusioning for young people, I think that's true. I also think that it's tremendously inspiring in terms of how a whole variety of people don't stand for it, right? And they try and do all sorts of things, right? So I think it's, again, that's where we began our conversation today. I think this is a more terrible history, no question. I think it's also more beautiful. And I think it gives us, I often ask my students, like, what did that old version of Rosa Parks do? And many times they say to me things like, you can't imagine doing it today, or the way that the civil rights movement is taught, you can't imagine yourself in it exactly, because it seems far away, and the rich organizing doesn't tend to make it into the way we teach it until you get to more specialized classes in college. And so I think that sense of yourself as an historical agent is also like really powerful for young people, and to see the role of teenagers, that it's so many places, whether we're talking about in Montgomery and two teenagers, Claudette Colvin and Mary Louise Smith, right, who make stands on the bus in Montgomery in the months before Rosa Parks, and are actually courageous enough to be willing to be plaintiffs on the federal case that they file into federal court, which is what leads to the desegregation of Montgomery's buses. That's two teenagers of the four women who are on that case. No men are on that case. No minister will be on that case, but two teenagers, right? One of the cases in Brown, right, from Prince Edward County, is started by a high school student strike, right, led by Barbara Johns, right? So the role that young people play in this history, I think, and also being honest that at the time, a lot of adults didn't like didn't like those actions, didn't, criticize those young people as being reckless, being, going too far, like endangering themselves, right? Criticisms that adults often have about youth activism today. So telling that more honest history about how youth activism is not just like given a warm and fuzzy embrace 50 years ago or necessarily today. So you're not necessarily going to be embraced in the moment that you're doing it. But that sense of kind of young people as historical actors, I think, is tremendously valuable and powerful, and I think is kind of, to me, the way into this history.
Thank you. We appreciate that. We have a question from someone who is thinking about the ways of nonviolent civil disobedience being so effective as part of the civil rights movement. And they're referring to a study by Omar Wazow from Princeton, who found that the nonviolent civil disobedience was more successful in affecting action. And they're wondering what you think about those findings, but also wondering about the relationship of violence or property destruction, recognizing that those are different things, right? That's happening here in Portland, and whether a movement that is seeking to bring everybody in and make space for folks who are engaged in property destruction is self-defeating in some way, based on this research around the effectiveness of nonviolence.
Okay. I think the first thing I would ask us to sort of be clear about is nonviolent civil disobedience is often going to feel very disruptive and is sometimes going to be treated as being violent. Just to give you an example, in 1964, the Brooklyn chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality, that's been sort of doing various kinds of protests of job discrimination, housing segregation, school segregation, hasn't gotten that much change. They decide 1964 is the year of the World's Fair. And they decide they're going to have a protest. They're going to stall their cars on the highways out to Flushing Meadows, where the World's Fair is going to be in Queens in 1964. And moderate Black and white civil rights leaders hate this idea. They go crazy, and they're like, "This is horrible." You know. And the New York Times calls it violent. The New York Times will call the 1964 school boycott violent, right? So I think the use of the word violent is a tricky word and is often deployed when you see very disruptive actions, whether it's in 1964 or today. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I think we sometimes airbrush out some of the moments that actually lead to change in the 60s. And I'm thinking about, so in Birmingham, right, we have this campaign in the spring of 1963, right? And we're familiar with, Martin Luther King goes to jail in April of 63, right? They're trying to escalate these kind of downtown protests, and you see young people getting involved and getting arrested in huge numbers in May, right? This is where we get the hoses and the police dogs, those very famous pictures, right? And out of that comes this really historic agreement between kind of downtown merchants in the city and civil rights leaders. And they make this agreement, and segregationists, after that agreement is signed, bomb the motel that King is staying at in his brother's house, the Gaston Motel. And there's this uprising in Birmingham that night. There's looting and there's anger because, look, like they basically tried to assassinate Martin Luther King. Nobody gets hurt or killed, thankfully. But there's this uprising that night. And it is after that uprising that we see President John Kennedy come out in favor of that agreement in Birmingham. Now, that's not necessarily the way we tell that story. We don't tend to, it's just like there's the movement and then Kennedy, and I think we often erase that uprising in Birmingham. So I think there are moments when uprisings like get public officials to realize that like there's an urgency to this thing they have not been treating as maybe as urgent as they should. So I guess that would be my second point. But again, the first point being that oftentimes disruptive actions, whether today or in the 60s, that are called violent because they're disruptive, because they are meant to disrupt the status quo, because they're meant to kind of shut down things that people don't want shut down. And then one of my favorite quotes from Dr. King. So again, with Stalin around the World's Fair in 64, all these civil rights leaders, they come to Dr. King, they're like, we want you to denounce this. King refuses. One of my favorite lines, like these, he's like, and I'm paraphrasing him, but basically he says, there's been all this talk about our direct action alienating our friends, he says. And if it does so, right, if this direct action alienates our so-called friends, they never were really our friends. And I think there he's basically saying, again, reiterating this necessity of disruption. And if people like are, being like, why, this sort of, again, we see this language in the letter from Birmingham jail, right? I admire your goals, but not your tactics, right? That there's a kind of comfort with the inequities of the status quo that's kind of embedded there.
Thank you very much. We are just about at 1 o'clock. So I want to let folks know that we will have a recording of this presentation put up on the OHS website. And we'll get that up in about 2 to 3 weeks. Also, there are wonderful resources. Oregon Black Pioneers hosted an exhibit called Racing to Change that was on the that was hosted at OHS. A virtual tour of that exhibit is available online through OHS and Oregon Black Pioneers. So thinking about that, teach the civil rights history of where you are. We have wonderful resources available on the OHS website as well for teaching about civil rights and activism history in Oregon. Also, our curriculum that goes with the Experience Oregon exhibit and the Nevertheless They Persisted exhibits. Both of those are great curriculums also for students in thinking about this subject of being historical actors. Yeah, please, Jeanne.
And we built a website around Rosa Parks called rosaparksbiography.org for teachers. I know a lot of teachers are on this call in terms of teaching Rosa Parks differently. Again, rosaparksbiography.org.
Thank you so much. We will also share that out as well, because that sounds really valuable. So I may see, some of you may see us back at 3 o'clock for the Nevertheless They Persisted workshop, but I just want to say again, thank you so much, Professor Theoharis, for this work, for taking the time to present to us today. When it's safe to do so, you are welcome to come to Portland and present to us in person. We would love it. And thanks everyone for taking time to your day to learn some of this important history. Everyone have a wonderful afternoon. Take care. Buy the book. It's great.
Thank you.
Thank you.